Okay, so participants are slowly coming in. We're gonna wait for another minute or so. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Before we start, this session is being recorded for publication on dgap.org and WonkComms websites, but only the speakers will be in camera. So this is for you as a heads up. And yeah, so now that we are recording, welcome again. We are live broadcasting from our living rooms. I am Luzia Leifert, head of the Impact and Innovation Lab at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and your host today. This is the third event in our web series on digital think tanking in times of COVID-19, for which we have teamed up with WonkComms and Soapbox. And today's topic is how are political processes changing due to COVID-19, and what does it mean for our work as think tanks? Why are we doing this web series? With the corona crisis disrupting normal operations, forcing staff to work remotely, putting an end to face-to-face events, and sending legislators and governments home, think tanks are having to rethink their business on the fly. For an industry that is built around cross-sector and transnational cooperation, this crisis verges on an existential threat to an entire model. And we found that we need new approaches, and we need them fast. And this is actually, you know, our little tiny contribution to this conversation, because we are convinced that there is indeed a silver lining in this otherwise dire crisis, because this is a moment for innovation, for new tools and skills that will extend beyond the immediate crisis and hopefully leave our organization stronger than ever. And we are in this together. So each week, experts from across our community will share tips and tools for bringing your work as a think tank online. And we are a community, so we want to know what interests people. And actually the topics we cover in this series have been brought up in numerous conversations with you, with our fellow think tankers. And we hope that our events are useful for you. So as a heads up already now, and I will say more about this later, while we first advertised only the first 3 events of this series, there's more to come as we build this series around your needs and suggestions as to what would be most useful for you. How to participate today? First of all, it's very helpful. Probably most of you are much used to Zoom now, to put on the gallery view so you can see all speakers at once. And you can drop your questions in the chat throughout the whole event. After our speakers will have shared their initial thoughts with us, we'll take them up. Also, of course, if you have tech problems, ask them in the chat. But for now, I would like to ask you to share your names and organizations in the chat. I can see we are 40 participants and counting, more dropping in by the minute. So just share your name and organization and potentially country in the chat box, and so we all see who's with us today. Also, there will be surveys. I'll say more about that in a minute. And feel free, of course, to live tweet using the hashtags WonkComms and Digital Think Tanking. So today's topic is, as I said before, how political processes change and what it means for our work as think tanks. Within the blink of an eye, the corona crisis has changed political processes around us. And I brought a couple of pictures with me today that might illustrate this. And that might actually look familiar to you as well. So elections are being postponed. This is an example from Poland, of course. Parliaments legislate in physical distance. This is the German Bundestag with all these little signs on the seats saying, please stay apart. We have video conferences replacing global summits. This is the G20. We have the video conferences replacing the UN Security Council meetings. And yeah, you've probably seen this. They have had their own share of technical problems that all of us have had. We have video conferences replacing the European Council meetings and cabinet meetings as well. And you know, in normal times, all of these are very different political decision-making processes and convening formats. And at the moment, they all seem to be replaced by a much smaller, narrow suite of digital instruments or being postponed. We've also seen that many political institutions are actually not prepared for this, going digital, this digitization of their whole work. And for example, in early April, we had a news report that only 4% of the Berlin city administration's officials were actually technically equipped to do their work from home. So this is of course a big problem. And also, I mean, which has been a bit of a fun aspect of this whole thing, is we get insights into living rooms, very intimate pictures that counteract any kind of political protocol. Of course, people, we just talked about this before, you know, politicians and others are positioning themselves in front of bookshelves and positioning maybe specific books behind them that they want to be seen or not. And then they get the backlash in social media later. So this is really a weird and interesting aspect of political communication nowadays. So our question today is, how do parliaments, governments, and parties work under lockdown, and how do they interact with think tanks in these circumstances? And on the other side of this is, of course, what types of think tank offers, products, and interactions do political decision makers need at this moment of crisis? And how could think tanks adapt their offerings to what is needed? But as I promised before, I'll introduce our two speakers for today. We'd like to know from you how the Corona crisis has changed your interaction with policymakers. So I'm gonna start a survey right now. You should see it on your screen. And please, just as I'm speaking, feel free to vote, everyone. Can you see it? Okay. Yes, we have with us today here two great speakers. I'm proud to introduce to you Will Tanner. Will is the founding director of Onward, a UK center-right think tank founded in 2018. They've just invested in a good espresso machine, as we learned, and now they can't really use it in the home office. Previously, Will worked as Deputy Head of Policy in number 10 Downing Street and as advisor to Theresa May in the Home Office. And he has 10 years of experience in UK politics. Will will share his observations from the UK. Welcome, Will.
Thank you.
And then we have Rena Rudolph is a German diplomat with the German Foreign Service. For the last 5 years, he worked with the Federal Chancellery working on European policy, including Brexit. And currently he is a senior fellow at DGAP.
Hi.
Both of our speakers, as you see, have first-hand knowledge working on both sides of the fence. So working for the government and for think tank. And that's why I think it's really great to have them with us today. So now, a couple of you are still voting. Keep doing that, and we'll start with. Okay, now I'm gonna publish the vote. So voting is up. So you should be able to see the votes now. Okay, so this is very interesting. We have 50% of you saying that the corona crisis has made policymakers more receptive to your advice. But also 44% have said that it actually hasn't changed much in terms of policymakers' interest for your advice. But that also says, of course, that only very few of you said that they're less receptive to your advice. So that's interesting because I get the feeling that they have so much to do and worry about at the moment. So this is actually a good sign. Has the corona crisis changed the offers that your thinking makes to policymakers? 63%, or 10 of you have said, we have changed our research focus to make it more relevant to what policymakers care about in a crisis. 56% have changed their products. So this was a question where you could choose several answers. And it looks that many of you have probably also chosen both of them, products and content. And none of you has said that it actually has changed, not much. So this is really, really, really a big deal for the corona crisis. Is really a big change maker for think tanks. And last, do you think the working mode of politics in your country will go back to how it was before the crisis? 25% think that political decision makers will be relieved to go back to normal. And 25%, so equal amount of you think that many political decision making processes will stay digital after COVID-19. And half of you think it's probably a mixed bag or we don't know yet. Okay, so this is very interesting to start us off with. And yeah, I'm handing over to Will, and you can already see his statement on the slide up there. Will, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much for having me here today. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience in the UK and how this crisis has panned out in Westminster. And I think my abiding feeling from the past 7 or 8 weeks is that coronavirus has pretty fundamentally changed the nature of UK politics, both in terms of the kind of practice, the way in which the game is played, but also the substance, actually, the nature of politics itself. And there are kind of a few ways in which I see that happening. So firstly, I think it is pretty clear, and I'm sure this is true in lots of other countries around the world, that there's only really one game in town, that the issues related to coronavirus and the associated economic impact are really the only thing that government is focusing on in a material way, and that lots of other issues are being pushed to the side. Now, clearly that means that all policy is kind of being experienced through the lens of the pandemic. But I think in kind of practical terms, it also means, certainly in the UK, that lots of policy is being pushed through a slightly different route than it would normally have been pushed through. So the centre of government, number 10, and the Treasury has become a lot more important in the last 7 or 8 weeks than it was beforehand, and the UK is a relatively centralised state anyway. So it's been very noticeable the extent to which decision making has become kind of concentrated in a relatively small number of people in the centre of government. And I also think that some of those decisions have probably become a lot more opaque than they normally would have been. So often taken behind closed doors with data that isn't in the public domain, in meetings that don't have their minutes published. And so there is a degree to which the kind of decision-making process of government has become more difficult to influence for organisations like us. And alongside that, I think the influence of some of the kind of normal outriders on policy, so members of parliament or the media, journalists, newspapers in particular, have diminished over the last 7 or 8 weeks. They are following rather than leading the conversation, and so I think that's one direct consequence of the pandemic that's definitely clear to me in the UK. The other thing I would say is that kind of a slight paradox to that is that despite the kind of funnel of politics becoming kind of smaller and a kind of a bigger bottleneck around just the issue of coronavirus, there is, I think, greater possibility for radicalism now than there has been potentially for a very long time. Governments have clearly had to do things that they would previously never have considered in the last 7 or 8 weeks. I'm sure we'll have to do more things that would previously have been off the table. And so despite kind of everything being pushed through this coronavirus funnel, actually, it feels like politics has become deeper and there's been more opportunity to innovate, to disrupt. I mean, it is kind of extraordinary to me that a Conservative government is now subsidising the wages of 55–60% of the UK working age population, and signing off interest-free loans with very few checks and balances to small businesses, in a way that a kind of fiscally conservative government in normal times would never even consider. So there is an opportunity for think tanks in that environment, I think, to be leading the conversation towards more radical or more out of the box thinking that traditional policy making inside government always finds difficult, because they're naturally more risk averse and more constrained by financial or kind of status quo restrictions that prevent them from thinking in those terms. So I think there is a very powerful role for think tanks in terms of providing radicalism in this moment. And then the final kind of material change that we're seeing is that the timetables and the horizon for politics and policy has shortened considerably in the UK. So decisions that previously would have taken 6 months to a year are now being taken in a matter of days. And the horizon to which ministers are thinking in terms of their policy initiatives is often kind of weeks or perhaps months, rather than 6 months, a year, 5 years. So ministers are very much in a kind of emergency mode where they're thinking not really 1 or 2 months ahead in the decisions they're taking. They might be kind of strategizing about it, but in day to day, they're focusing on the immediate. I think for think tanks that poses an interesting challenge, because certainly what we do at Onward is we always try to be thinking about what problems government should be thinking about or kind of doing stuff about in 6 months' time, not the stuff that they're doing today. There's always limited value trying to influence decisions that are being taken right now, because lots of the work will already have been done inside government. So we always try to be slightly ahead of policymakers. But if they're only focusing on the issues at hand, then that changes the nature of our work and forces us, I think, to be more reactive than we might normally be, and also to be much quicker in the type of analysis that we do. So inevitably, we are doing shorter, more concise, punchier papers that try and get an idea out there quickly, or try and get a piece of analysis that we think is important out there more quickly, rather than spending an extended period of perhaps months researching an issue in serious depth and coming up with a very considered and kind of thought through, well socialized answer. So I think that is changing the nature of our work, and inevitably we are also having to be much more digital in the way in which we operate. So clearly lots of our products are now entirely digital. The idea of sending out printed reports to people seems completely alien now, even just 2 months on from the beginning of the crisis. But I think also lots of our engagement with policymakers is becoming very different to how it was previously. I mean, I spend more of my time on WhatsApp, in WhatsApp groups and Zoom calls, and speaking to parliamentarians and special advisors and others digitally than I ever probably did when in person, just because it's so much easier and the kind of flow of information is so much quicker now. So it is kind of materially changing the way in which we operate, both in terms of the kind of substance and the practice of our business. But as I say, I think there are big opportunities in that, as well as some of the challenges.
Thank you very much, Will. That's very interesting. Yeah, now I hand over to my colleague Rena, who will share his observations from Berlin and Brussels with us.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Maybe to pick up where we left. So I'd like to maybe add the angle of how this works at one international level, which is the European level. And as you said in your introduction, Claire, so I worked in German government until last year, and at DGAP now I'm trying to, try to help figure out how interaction between the government system and the think tank world can improve. And looking at the international policy apparatus in crisis mode, what struck me is there's two things. There is a new agenda and there's a new work mode. And both have to be taken together. So the new agenda means that leaders, when they meet, they suddenly, through the crisis, some items are pushed up the agenda, obviously everything that's around economic recovery and the health situation, and others are simply pushed down because there's simply no political space to deal with them. And at the same time, the work mode changes substantially because obviously they can't meet. They meet through conference calls just like we do now. And you have to, I think you have to see those two together. They wouldn't be prepared to take routine decisions through a video conference call if they didn't have to. And the decisions they take now are extremely consequential. Just look at the economic recovery programs that are being discussed, huge amounts of money that are being moved. And at the same time, they're working under working methods with large constraints. Maybe to illustrate this with just one example of how these European meetings in Brussels work, and this goes for heads of state and government meeting in the European Council, or essentially the same goes for ministers' meetings. When they meet, and they meet in the room, that is one level of communication. You have 27 people sitting around a table and they discuss an issue and hopefully they achieve some kind of result and an outcome. But this isn't the only communication that typically takes place in such a meeting. There's other forms of communication. Leaders will just talk to each other like we would do as they go to the room. They have a cup of coffee during a break. This is missing. Then you have their collaborators, who will be in their delegation, who will be having discussions outside the meeting room of the political leaders. This doesn't take place. There's no substitute for that in the conference call. Then there is this entire level of communication where they go out, meet stakeholders, meet with the press, communicate what they're doing. This isn't taking place. So already here in this, this little example, you have with this one meeting, which sort of comprises at least 4 levels of communication, and only one of them is replaced through the conference call, which they have now. So what does this mean for think tank input? I think those between 50 and 60% who said in the survey they adapt both in terms of new policy proposals and in terms of new forms of interaction are getting it completely right, because you have to look at both those elements. You have to understand what new questions are being asked, to what new questions are they looking for an answer. And I would argue in the initial phase, maybe around mid-March, there was this window of opportunity where think tanks could even provide questions that politicians hadn't even thought of asking at that stage. I think now, 2 months into the crisis, it's become much clearer. Everybody is much further in wanting to, in knowing what they want to know. But in order to have an impact, it's not only about covering the right topics, but also offering them in a new way. And the Zoom talks we're all doing, that's one instrument. It can be very simple things, giving people a call whom you would otherwise have met for a cup of coffee, sending them emails more regularly. There's a ton of things you can do, but I think that the core challenge is to realize they are in an extremely unusual situation, both in terms of the scope of the decisions they have to take and the way they are working in this time of crisis, And if you want to have an impact, you have to take both of those into consideration. And if you do, then my experience is they are quite open to input from outside. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Rena, I think that was a very interesting perspective to hear how the situation is looking in Germany and in the EU. I'm going to ask a couple of questions as a host, but I already want to encourage everyone to post your questions that you might have to Will or Rena in the chat, and we will take them up in a minute. Also, please feel free to share your observations from your country and your thinking with us. You can write them in the chat and we will mention them later on. Have you observed similar dynamics or rather something else entirely? So that's very interesting to see how it pans out in different countries and policy fields that all of us are working in. Yeah, I think a couple of the things that you have mentioned are very interesting. So I think both of you said that you're that you observe policymakers are or politics is changing both in terms of processes and in terms of substance. And I think this is a very holistic kind of change that we're witnessing right now. A bit of a weird time to be alive, but also maybe a great time to be in a think tank and being in a position to actually, you know, be part of this change and maybe contribute some of these like more radical ideas and innovative proposals that you mentioned, that there's a bit more openness for that now. I was wondering a couple of things that I would like to go back to that you mentioned. So what do you think, like how does a normal or very practical workday under lockdown look like for a legislator, maybe on the one hand, and for a policymaker in government? And do you think, or do you observe they have rather more or less time? Because there's been a discussion around this, you know, are they easier to get to or not? And also maybe Will, you might want to share some insights from your WhatsApp groups that you mentioned. So I think everyone is very familiar with Zoom events and meetings online, but like what kinds of WhatsApp groups do you recommend, or what kind of, you know, direct communication channels do you use to get to policymakers in addition to maybe calls? I think your mic is.
You first or Rena first?
Yeah. Please, Will. Yeah. Maybe you go first.
So just answering your first question about how parliamentarians and policymakers' lives have changed. I mean, in my experience, most policymakers are suffering lots of the same challenges that the rest of the country, their constituents are. So I have been on Zoom calls with parliamentarians disturbed by young children who are not in school, and parliamentarians kind of suffering in their spare bedroom, having to try and make do in a busy household, kind of quarantining or self-isolating during the virus. So I think in many ways, I think the life of parliamentarians is very similar to the rest of us. I've been struck by how quickly Parliament has been able to go online, and the kind of virtualization of politics. And several MPs have said to me that they feel like they never have to go back to Westminster again. So I think there is a kind of an opportunity potentially for politics to change around this. Just on WhatsApp, I mean, the UK, it may not be the same in other countries, but the UK had already had quite a long established tradition of WhatsApp groups circulating various bits of material that people wanted to stay out of the media, and WhatsApp had well and truly kind of infected British politics during the Brexit debate. So it's really a continuation of that. But it is interesting the extent to which these new digital forms of communication are allowing people to just communicate much more quickly and much more freely among groups of MPs, and they're therefore able to organise in a way that normally at a time like this they would have found very difficult. So I think it's allowing some of those group interactions that are so important to politics, the kind of creation of caucuses, the development of coalitions, to happen even though everyone is self-isolating in their homes.
What do you think? What do you observe, Rena, for policymakers in Germany and in the UK and in the EU more broadly?
Well, first, fairly similar. I think everybody is struggling with similar challenges. Everybody discovers that working remote actually is more time consuming than meeting in person. Nobody I met has really been able to figure out why this is, but I think everybody's making this same observation. It's more cumbersome to reach a result through phone calls or many phone calls or video conference calls. So that is one thing. Then there's the obvious challenges everyone had, like childcare, as Will mentioned, for those with small kids. So I think that's fairly similar. I mean, on the upside, I would say, from my experience at DGAP, it is also easier to both invite panelists to virtual events and to have guests for events. So, like for one little event I regularly host, we've been trying to get someone from Brussels for weeks, and which hadn't been possible. And now we're going. It turns out it's much easier for her to just come, if you like, to join us from her desk for an hour from Brussels than to travel to Berlin for a day. So that can be easier. What I also noticed is that, for this event where we typically have about 20, 25 people coming, the first time we did it online, we suddenly had 40 people, because for guests as well, it's easier to just take their own cup of coffee, as you said, and join us from the laptop computer from home than to come to our place, which, it's, in Berlin, it's like an hour to get there and an hour to get back to work. So it's not all bad, but essentially it turns out it is much more difficult than the usual routine, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one other aspect that you mentioned, Rainer, that I found very important is that you said, in politics, there are so many layers of communication and coffee breaks, bilads, informal meetings with the press, and so on, and that the official timetable of like a council summit or similar, it's actually just if you put this online and replace it by a video call, it's basically only replacing one layer of many of communication, and that is so vital. So what I was wondering is what do you think will be the consequences of this lack of personal and informal interaction in politics? Because especially in times of crisis, we know that this is very important, these like more personal and emotional aspects maybe, and it conveys much more information also than can be conveyed online. So yeah, what do you think will be the consequences?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
So I think what will happen is that the immediate crisis management agenda will dominate everything, because those are decisions you can't escape. You can't escape the question, what to do with potential unemployment, the example that Will gave earlier, what to do with curfews, what to do with border closures, and so on. Those are decisions that are simply there, so you can't escape them. On the other hand, I find it difficult to imagine that you will really be able to, work on new items that you would usually want to be working on that bring your country or the EU or whatever forward. Because my sense is this crisis work mode really constrains you to crisis management. You can do that, but from what I see over these first 2 months, this is what happens. It works reasonably well, also at our national level. I mean, our Chancellor Angela Merkel, she worked from home for 2 weeks because she was self-isolating. She even chaired a meeting of our cabinet, our Council of Ministers, from her phone. So this can work for a while, but I find it difficult to imagine that it can last. So this is why I would expect there will be strong pressure to return to normal work modes as soon as it's feasible. But we'll see how this plays out. I noted that the poll was divided on that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you think will, from your observation or like thinking into the future, what will be the consequences of this lack of personal and informal communication? And especially maybe also, you know, between countries or between, you know, we see all this polarization in our societies today. And, you know, I think in times of polarization, it's very important to get together, you know, and maybe sometimes just have like a glass of wine or beer and like talk things over, or even coffee. So I was wondering, like, what do you think? What do you think in the UK will be the case later?
Well, I think, so I think my personal view is that I think things won't go back to normal. I think there will be permanent changes as a result of the crisis to the way in which virtually every industry and community behaves, and I think that the way in which we interact with one another at a professional level in politics, but also at a personal level in our communities, is going to have to adapt. I think in terms of politics, I think there will be a desire for some return to something like normality, so a degree of physical interaction. But I suspect we will continue to have large amounts of politics done in more remote and virtual ways. Certainly, I think digital events have been a big success for lots of organizations and allowed them to reach new audiences, and I suspect lots of organizations will try and do more events digitally than they previously did, and that will be an enduring consequence. And I suspect in our local communities, I mean, it's interesting, the UK response, actually the kind of the real thing that's characterized the first 2 months of this crisis has been communities coming together to support each other at a hyper-local level. And I suspect we will see the localization of people's kind of worlds. I think people will spend more time in their neighborhood. There'll be more, I think the crisis has exposed the fact that people actually want and should rely on local people more than they perhaps were doing in the run-up to the crisis. So I think we might see a kind of re-emergence of more community spirit, which will be a good thing. But I think a lot of it is still really uncertain. And I think if this goes on for a really extended period of time, I mean, we're in the UK, we're likely not to really be coming out of lockdown, I think, properly, at least for another 3 or 4 weeks and potentially longer. And I suspect lots of industries will not really reopen before the end of the year. Then the way in which we interact is going to change fundamentally, and new habits will be formed that will be very difficult to break. And our kind of whole modes of living will adapt to a much more kind of socially limited environment, and so I don't know exactly how that will pan out, but I suspect localization will be a big part of it.
Yeah, a couple of questions from the chat box have referred to Will, what you said earlier, that you observed that political processes have become less transparent, decision making, timetables faster. So, and you said that, you know, that this actually leads to less avenues for think tanks and others to influence these processes from the outside. And there has been also observations from other regions. So here, Sonia writes that in Central European and Balkan countries, actually this kind of, you know, more focus on the executive at the expense of the parliament, and this closing up this funnel that you mentioned, it's actually also leading to a rise of authoritarianism. And we've also witnessed this like in Poland and Hungary, and, you know, so the question is there a way for think tanks to fight this without, you know, being out in the open and saying, you know, you should meet and we should put an end to lockdown? Like, is there a way we can advocate for openness in these times? Well, what do you think?
So I think it is definitely true that this crisis has led.
Excuse me, maybe also monitor, you know, this performance of government and who influences policy. Yeah.
Well, I say, yeah. So I think so it's definitely true in the UK that the kind of normal processes for monitoring and holding government to account for outcomes, but also for their decision-making process have narrowed considerably. I mean, we now have most decisions taken by a smaller group of people. The kind of there's a group of 4 senior cabinet ministers in the UK who are taking the majority of decisions before they're being put to a broader cabinet. So there's a kind of a funneling of the decision-making process. That's also been in the UK. That's been informed by a committee of scientists, which I think was referenced in one of the questions, who are not elected. They are scientific experts, and until last week they weren't. The membership of that group was not transparent, and that's created a number of controversies. So there clearly has been a kind of kind of move to greater opacity in government decision making. To be perfectly honest, I don't think that's necessarily all bad or unjustified. Like, I think government is moving at extraordinary pace, and will have to be making decisions in such a way that kind of large amounts of normal scrutiny could hold up and potentially cost large amounts of lives and potentially have a huge economic impact. So, like, there is actually, I think, quite a good argument for government operating in a different way, but there are limits on that. And so I think so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to be careful in terms of how think tanks operate within that environment. I mean, bluntly, the way in which we're doing it is relying much more heavily on our personal relationships with senior people in government and going direct. So doing much less to try and influence the public debate and the kind of the broad sphere around politics, and just trying to go straight to government saying, this is something you need to care about. This is an answer to a problem. Here's how you do it. Can we help? And so that in itself is a really untransparent way for us to work, and is problematic in some respects, but it's the only real way for us to get stuff done quickly, and to intervene into that process. With regards to other states, and especially Hungary and Central European states, I think this is the great risk, that the crisis is a cover for some leaders in different countries effectively to introduce anti-democratic or deliberately obstructive policies in order to prevent legitimate criticism, and that's something that I just think is just the type of thing that we need to watch, and we need to campaign against and make sure that there's the right level of pressure on governments to ensure that doesn't happen. I mean, clearly there's a big question for the EU with regard to Hungary in particular, and I know a debate is raging on that front. So there are lots of questions there, but I think it is more difficult to monitor, full stop, and it probably is much more difficult in countries like that where the crisis is being used as a reason to do certain things.
Yeah, very much connected to this topic, and maybe Rena, you can say something about this. I wonder, this is also probably something that's different in different countries and political cultures. Is for example, in Germany, we have seen, also of course some misinformation happening, but also at the same time, it looks as if, you know, the relationship between science and policy is also reshaped a lot at the moment, and we have a couple of virologists and epidemiologists who have become, you know, instant stars and like have been famed to, you know, is this going to be our next chancellor and so on Twitter. So here's a question also, like maybe there's also some positive aspects that we can see in these scientific commissions, which seem to have tremendous impact on policymaking right now. So yeah, so two questions from the chat that relate directly to that. So one idea would be, you know, do we see renewed trust in experts being brought into decision-making processes, or might it go the other way? So is there actually a way of think tanks? Right now, I mean, it's mostly STEM, you know, it's mostly natural sciences that benefit from this trust in experts. Do you see it also happening for social science think tanks? And also a question here. So is there maybe even a way of seeing these scientists as a target group for our work? So could we actually find a route to influence them? And if so, how do we engage them? Maybe Rena, you want to start?
Well, to the first point, is there a renewed trust in experts? I mean, I don't know how it is in other countries. Here in Germany, I thought it was absolutely extraordinary to what degree experts from work areas, which most of us, you know, wouldn't even have been able to spell two months ago, were granted influence on policy decisions of huge scope. I mean, we had restrictions of all our civil liberties, you know, which we didn't have in decades, and there were even more severe restrictions in other European countries, of course. And all this was founded on very specialized expertise. Now, I would, however, add, this wasn't accepted because the experts said so, but because it was then sort of conveyed through politicians in whom society had trust. I mean, it wasn't all those epidemiologists and virologists who said we have to do this, but it was politicians who said, we trust these experts, you, the public, can trust us or have to trust us, and we'll stay in control of the process. And in fact, just right this week, this is what's happening with these yesterday's decisions on opening parts of our public life, reopening parts of our public life with regional differentiation, is just exactly that. It's sort of the political process regaining the upper hand over the voice of the experts. Now, that brings me to your second point. You know, should think tanks try to work through these experts? I'm not sure if I'm thinking of DGAP. I mean, we're very far from every medical and health expertise. Maybe it's more about bringing those experts together, you know, bring them into a political policy debate together, you know, with our own areas of expertise. Because right now, what I think it is, the knowledge they bring is extremely specialized, and some of them, I think, are themselves surprised how, you know, how influential they have become, and maybe it would be, as this crisis, you know, as we slowly get over the crisis, would be worthwhile to expand our own area of work beyond our traditional, you know, more typical foreign policy, European policy, security policy expertise, to bring in those kinds of experts into our own work. I would rather think of it that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Will?
So I think on the question of experts, I mean, so I would largely agree with Rena. I mean, Onward is not known for its epidemiology, if I can put it like that. We are not modelers of medical issues. We're not kind of public health experts. So we have explicitly avoided getting too involved directly in that debate. But I do think that those experts have played a very influential role in the immediate response to the crisis, as it sounds like it's been the case in Germany too. And to the extent that, as Rena says, that some of these experts have become kind of minor celebrities and splashed over the front page of this morning's newspapers, actually, for various indiscretions. So there is an interesting question there. I mean, on one level, I think it's quite encouraging that some of these decisions are being taken in the public domain. So the UK decision to lockdown was directly influenced by a paper from Imperial College London that was published on the day of lockdown being announced for everyone to scrutinise and read. And lots of people who would never normally have read an epidemiology report read this paper, and we were sharing the graphs on Twitter.
Yeah, in Germany we have a lot of podcasting going on, like virologists having their own, like even daily podcasts, you know, with thousands of listeners, and many radio shows that have been running for a long time, you know, in science journalism can just dream of this interest, you know, that's been there. But yeah, it's really a question if we can benefit from that as more like social scientific institutions.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some way, I think it's quite encouraging because it shows a democratization of the decision-making process, right? And so that does give confidence to me that if we can influence on other issues, then we can add to that. But I don't think from a think tank point of view, we would ever want to try and replicate or compete with that analysis, but we might want to. I mean, I don't really think of Onward as an expert. We're not really experts, but what we do is we can filter data and analysis, economic, social, whatever, and through a political lens in order to give ideas to government that they might want to take up. And I think we can still do that using data from epidemiologists or virologists or some of the scientific analysis, and we could so our role doesn't change. It's just a different input, as it were. It's no longer the kind of economic analysis, perhaps, or the social analysis. It's other forms of data that we're able to filter through a more political or policy making lens.
Mm-hmm. And do you think we should, you know, use these influential scientists as target groups for our own work?
So I think they've probably got a very interesting contribution to make, but as Rena says, alongside others, I think the danger comes when the kind of public health perspective, as it were, becomes the only voice that you're listening to. Like, the whole point of politics is deliberative. Like, we are balancing different competing concerns in order to come to something that the public will withstand democratically, and which is going to benefit the country economically and socially. And that's always a balancing act between different voices. And I think the interesting thing, and the reason why I'm not one of those people who attacks the role that scientists have had in this process, is that the public are in exactly the same place as the virologists. I mean, in the UK, all of the polling evidence suggests that people are terrified of reopening lockdown because of the risk of a second spike. And they are very willing, by the way, to give up their civil liberties in the process. So I think at the moment, there isn't a conflict between what the people want and what the scientists want. And therefore, I don't see necessarily a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a couple more questions before we have to wrap this up. Are more in the direction of like what new formats or what new forms of interaction you found with different stakeholders. So one question is how are you engaging with the media? Have journalistic practices or needs changed? Are you doing anything differently? I don't know if you want to speak to that maybe, and also maybe what alternative formats colleagues are experimenting with beyond webinars and the kind of Zoom meetings that we've done. And also connected is, so this is a bit of a triple question, is new people, new attendees, that you haven't known before. I think it's always, as you said, we're relying much more on direct contacts, but these are contacts that have been established before the lockdown. So have you found any ways how to network with those that you didn't know pre-lockdown? So journalists, webinar alternatives, and new networks.
Shall I go first? So my experience of journalists and the media is that they are operating broadly as they were before, but it's much less organized and much more sporadic than it previously was. So our office actually happens to be in the main media building in London for Millbank. So we previously had like a really good relationship with large numbers of journalists who we'd see on a daily basis. Now we don't have that. So it's much more individual, the relationships, and it's often just checking in from time to time to see what people think and to talk to them about some of our work, rather than kind of more regular or orchestrated catch-ups. And that's also true at a political level, where the kind of lobby, the political lobby has all gone virtual, and I think is much less of a pack of journalists scrutinizing government. They're now much more disaggregated in the way in which they're operating. But broadly, I think the process is kind of happening as it was. The thing I would just add is that most journalists seem to already be very, very sick of writing about coronavirus and want to write about other things. So perhaps there is some light for other subjects. On alternative methods, both kind of Zoom and contacting people. I mean, we are also experiencing Zoom fatigue mainly in our organisation, and so good old-fashioned phone calls and emails are probably becoming a bit more prevalent. But we do, the video call is still well used, and on Twitter. I mean, Twitter is the way in which we do contact some people, but often it's through personal connections rather than through public forums like that.
So new contacts via Twitter, direct messaging.
Yeah, a bit, not huge amounts, but a bit.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Rena? How do you keep your networks or actually extend them during lockdown?
Well, first, but again, I'm not sure if this is really a unique experience. I noticed you simply have to make more of an effort, reach out to people whom you would normally simply meet regularly at meetings, at events. So, and again, as I think I said earlier, in most cases, reactions are positive because everybody is sitting at home and everybody is happy when they get a phone call and have an excuse not to look after their kids for half an hour or so. I agree it is more difficult to actually expand the network simply because many of those situations where you would usually get in touch with someone, they simply don't happen. You may be sitting next to someone at an event and get into a conversation. This doesn't happen on a Zoom call if you're on the attendee list in the Zoom window. On formats and events, I said earlier, I think there will be a strong urge to go back to normal. I agree, however, I think there will be we will all take up this experience we're having now and maybe develop some new hybrid formats like, partially online, partially in person, or having in-person events where you have a guest through a video link, which is, by the way, what many of the German TV talk shows are doing these days, because simply their guests don't want to travel as much. So where you usually might have had 5 or 6 people in a room, you now have 3 and 2 on TV monitors just through a video link. So in this sense, we may wake up to a new reality. I don't know when. 6 months, a year or so from now. But at the same time, I think there are so many positives of the usual work mode where we meet in person and have discussions, the direct discussions, that I think we'll want to get back to that as much as we can.
Yeah. So to wrap this up on a positive note, maybe if you could just share, both of you, one thing that that you observed today that you would like to keep for the time after the crisis, or maybe even institutionalize it. What would that be? One word.
Oh, that's hard. So this is a very boring answer, but there are parts of working from home and having a decentralized office that I think are brilliant, and there are elements of that which make me much more productive. So I will definitely keep that in part after the crisis.
Including the coffee. Is the coffee better than the office?
Including the home coffee engine.
Okay. What about you, Rena?
I think I agree on that. I come from a work environment which is very focused on long in-person meetings. And, on many work days, you will you know, you will spend your day in meetings and then you suddenly discover it's 5 p.m. and then what's your real work starts. And I think if we all take a more relaxed approach to that, it might be helpful. And maybe, you know, figure out it's okay to work from home 1 day out of 5 per week, which, you know, isn't the usual thing that used to happen before. So maybe such, you know, elements like this, if we can preserve those, it might even be quite useful afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is really also what I want to encourage everyone and all of us, including myself, to really think of also as every crisis is also a time of innovation. We've had such a radical disruptive change within such a short time, and we can just see, you know, look at the positives and grow them, as somebody mentioned here in the chat. So thanks a lot. Thank you, both of you, for joining us today. Thank you everyone else here for being with us here today and sharing your thoughts and observations from your countries and policy fields. I hope you liked today's event. We will just send a feedback survey right now, and please also let us know what you think in the chat box. You can also share your suggestions for upcoming topics and speakers in the chat. And of course, any ideas on how we could make this web series even more relevant for you and the work you do. In terms of documentation, we have received many requests for our recordings from the last 2 events. We plan to put all 3 of them, including this one, online next week, and let everyone know via email. So this is going to come soon. And here is the feedback survey for you. Upcoming events, as I said in the beginning, there is more to come. The next one will be next Thursday, 14th of May. It will be on the question, cybersecurity and data protection, how to enable safe spaces for sensitive conversations online. And many of us have been struggling with this, especially as more and more news about data protection and bugs and problems with Zoom and similar tools coming up in the news. So this is, I hope, will be useful for many of us. And after that, we will switch to a bi-weekly rhythm. So if you are interested in the next event, you can already register now. I'm going to post the link in the chat box. So I hope you can see that now. And yeah, please also continue the conversation, continue it on Twitter using the hashtags WonkComms and Digital Think Tanking, and we can keep in touch on this and exchange, you know, also on these like positive that we want to keep and where we want to learn from each other, because as I said in the beginning, we're all in this together. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, please feel free to fill in the feedback survey and let us know in the chat box what your suggestions are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you get the link? Somebody said they didn't get the link. Ah, wait 1 second. Yes. I sent it to the wrong. That's a classic. Here. You should now have it. This is the link to the event. Great. And of course, you can always send me an email. Good old-fashioned email. That's how fast innovation goes. Emails are old-fashioned already. Okay, thank you, everyone. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.